Good evening. How you doing? Are you having a good time? Are you staying cool? You want to come a little closer? Our panel this evening is called Always the Bad Guy. I think you can guess what it's going to be about. We've just met, the four of us, but I will start by introducing Stephen Owad.
Close enough.
Betty Cross, and Susan Calder. I'm Dave Gross. I will be doing very little to moderate the panel except to ask everyone to introduce him or herself, and then I'll start with a question. We'll go for a little while, and then when we run out of clever ideas, we'll open the floor to your clever ideas. How does that sound? All right. Steve, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Okay, I'm a local... Is this on? You don't hear me? No? How's that?
There you go.
Okay. I'm a local boy. I write crime novels. I've just published my third. It's just out now. It's titled Hard Currency. And I come from a journalism background, and I've dabbled in all sorts of fields with playwriting, screenplays. Started off with short stories, really flowery poetry for the smaller literary magazines back in university. But these days, the main gig is crime writing, and I have lots of really juicy villains in my books. So that's me, more or less.
My name is Betty Cross. I am from North Carolina, which is across the border down the ways. I may have been the person that traveled furthest to get here, in contrast to Mr. Owad. I write science fiction and fantasy. I have one novel of each. This is my fantasy novel, most recent, Mistress of the Topaz, which I will be reading tomorrow. Actually, I'll be reading it Sunday morning at 11 a.m. And this is what you put up if you want to display an e-book. Because an e-book is digital and therefore invisible, I just made up a card with the cover art on it. This is Discarded Faces. It's my young adult dystopia. And if that sounds very, very contemporary, in a way it's not, because I finished this novel in 1997. And it took me a very long time to get it placed with a publisher, but finally did in 2010 through Double Dragon eBooks over in Toronto, and or is it Ottawa, one or the other. And I really feel like I was ahead of the curve on this YA dystopian thing.
Okay.
Yep.
Switch.
Yeah, right there? Now it's okay? Good. Hi, I'm Susan Calder. I have published one murder mystery novel. It's set in Calgary. I'm a local Calgary person, too. That was published last year. And I'm working on a sequel to it. It's going to be a series character. So it's a murder mystery whodunit. I have published a little poetry and some short stories as well in other magazines. And I've also written 2 drafts of a novel I might describe as kind of a literary novel, but with suspense aspects, which is a different type of novel for me.
I'm Dave Gross. I used to be what I called an editor who sometimes wrote, and now I'm a writer who sometimes edits. I used to edit magazines like Dragon and Star Wars Insider, and for a very short, happy time, Amazing Stories. I wrote some Forgotten Realms novels back in the day, and lately I've been writing novels for the Pathfinder world. The first one is called Prince of Wolves. The second is Master of Devils. I also helped Elaine Cunningham on a book called Winter Witch. All 3 of those are right inside the dealer's room. If you step inside and turn to your right, they're right there. The new one comes out in October. It's called Queen of Thorns. It's got a really pretty cover. Very pretty.
That is a nice cover. That is a very nice cover there, yeah.
And these days I have a day job again. I am writing dialogue for characters in a game called Baldur's Gate. We're bringing it back for the PC, Mac, and iPad and Android. Should be available in about a month or so, I think. And that's it. Now we're going to talk about villains. I thought very hard about one introductory question, and I kept it really simple. I like 2 kinds of villains. I like the really primal villains, like Darth Vader before you know anything about his screwed-up childhood, when he's just this incredible vision of fury and strength and evil. He kills the good wizard, and he tortures the princess, and he's just plain evil. I love that kind of villain. But I also like the villain whose point of view you understand. The guy who you almost want to win sometimes and who you sympathize with to a certain extent. That's the kind of villain I usually write. How about you?
Me? Well, so far I think I've gone for your second kind of villain, a more subtle kind, you might say, and somebody that we can understand. Because I think I just have this idea that almost any of us could kill, given the right circumstances and that. And I like to explore that kind of idea.
My attitude toward villains is basically that they need to be interesting, not just evil. And I tried to, for the Mistress of Topaz, there are 4 main point of view characters, and my villain is someone that I spend a good deal of time with in the course of the book, showing out how she thinks, how she perceives the world around her, how she manipulates other people for her own ends, and so forth. I think it's very important to spend some time inside the head of your villain, no matter how malicious she or he may be.
Okay. Well, I am not very interested in villains who are 100% evil. You can find them in a lot of fiction, a lot of crime fiction, my chosen genre. Usually they are just greedy at the end of the day. They do what they do because they want money. They want. To me, that seems like someone who is kind of broken. It's not very human to me. Nobody is 100% evil. Well, most people are not 100% evil. If your villains are going to be memorable, the ones that I like to read, the ones that I remember, certainly, whether in a book or in a movie, they're human. They have some kind of frailty. They have some kind of flaw. They have some kind of longing. They don't have to be poets. They can be, real nasty badasses if necessary. But there has to be something to latch onto. Otherwise, they're just not human and they're just not interesting. And they're going to get it in the end. 99% of the time. So that's a real important element for me to have a flesh and bones type of villain.
Good. Another question I sometimes think about. I like film and television every bit as much as I like books. So some of my examples might drift away from literature. Is there a difference between an anti-hero and a villain? And I'm thinking of characters like Michael Corleone, who's clearly the protagonist of the Godfather films. But you can't argue that he's a hero, although he does start that way at the beginning of the story. He's a war hero. And then characters like Walter White on Breaking Bad, who at the very beginning of the series is clearly a good, decent fellow, but the stated goal of that series is to take a protagonist and turn him into an antagonist. Now, do you have to be the antagonist to be a villain, or can you still be the protagonist? What's an anti-hero? Anything about this?
Well, the lines get blurred in some of the best books that I've read. A good example, Mystic River. The hero, if you haven't read the book, the movie, the guy played by Sean Penn. Turns out in the end, he's a murderer. He murders. And not only does he murder, but he gets away with it. And he's more or less okay with it. And his wife is more or less okay with it. And it's implicit that his community is more or less okay with it because it's understood. I could quibble with that ending, but certainly that's he's the protagonist, but he's not a very nice person in the end, right? There are the elements of the villain to him, and his terrible act is something that you get the sense that he could commit at any time again, yet he gets away with it. So anti-hero versus villain versus antagonist, protagonist. I tend not to think in those terms. I tend to think in terms of what do the characters want, what does the main character want, and what does this other character or set of characters set up in opposition against them. What do they want? That's obviously going to be something different, right? And not everyone can get what they want in the end. So, yeah.
Yes, it might just depend on who the author has chosen to make the point of view character, the one you're going to identify with and go along with it. And as you described some of those people, they could easily be the villain in somebody else's story, but it's the job of the writer to somehow make that character sympathetic. And I certainly admire writers who can take a really negative character like that and bring us along with them. It's quite a skill. I think they often have to have some kind of, I guess, redeeming or quality that you see as positive. For instance, Michael Corleone, he would have this family loyalty, which is a positive trait and very strong. Of course, it becomes destructive for him, but at least that's something we can admire in him, and maybe that's part of the trick.
Well, the thing that Michael Corleone always struck me as a very tragic figure because he keeps trying to take his family. He said, 5 years from now, we'll be completely legit. 5 years later, he's still saying the same thing. In 5 years, we'll be completely legit. Every time we try to get out, something pulls us back in. He can't escape from the mobster world, which he was born into and he was destined to be a leader in.
So his desire to get pulled out is another thing that we feel is a positive side of him. So maybe he just has enough little positives that we can get to him.
Yeah, we kind of hope that eventually he'll get straightened out. But events seem to consider the loyalties he has to his family to his family, the crime family. Those loyalties that keep pulling him back in. You know, he's even complaining. They keep pulling me back in. They keep pulling me back in.
I'm sorry to stick with movies again, but one thing that really bugs me about most superhero movies, although they're starting to change, is that they take a perfectly good villain and they kill him at the end. What the hell's up with that? Because everybody knows that when Batman catches a villain, he puts him in Arkham Asylum, because otherwise he can't break out and do it again. And what's the point? I wonder if in the fiction that you've written or the fiction that you enjoy, you've seen some recurring villains that you really liked or admired.
Usually I'm not like that. I get rid of my villains. Other ones can always come along.
Well, don't in the comics they recur, like the Penguin keeps coming back. I don't know, do they kill them in the movies? I haven't.
In the movies, they often do.
They do? Catwoman has 9 lives, though, so she's good. I don't know.
One of the worst movies of the past decade, Catwoman,
Yeah.
my God.
Yeah. But I would probably, in my stories, tend to put the villain away, and then, that they're in jail because we don't have capital punishment, and I don't really have them killed at the end so far.
You don't have capital punishment in Canada at all?
No, we have taxes. I think you have to have a really good reason to keep your villain alive, or to let them go free, or to let them go unpunished. You have to really know what you're doing, and you have to really have a strong moral sense of the story, I think, because readers, they will call you on it. They want, whether it's conscious or not, they want some kind of redemption, some kind of happy ending, to put it as a cliche at the end, and they expect it. They expect it's a moral universe. They expect moral balance. So it's very difficult, and so there are some very great villains that do get away with it. Michael Corleone, good example. Sean Penn, another. I don't remember the character's name in Mystic River, but those do stick with me. But boy, you have to know what you're doing if you're going to write someone like that.
I think it would be fun, though, in a series to in a later book, because we just put them in jail, have the killer released, because we don't keep them in jail too long sometimes here, or escaped or something, and come back and bug the protagonist again, except you've kind of given away the first books to new readers of your series, if that killer is referred to in the previous book. So I think you'd have to have a really loyal following who would pick up the earlier references and also not consider it a spoiler from the earlier book.
I find that a lot of readers and viewers and authors like villains so much that there's a danger that the audience might start to gravitate toward the villain rather than the hero. For example, this might not be the best example, but since we've been talking comic book movies, who got top billing in Batman when Tim Burton did it. It was Jack Nicholson as the Joker. It wasn't just because it was Jack Nicholson. It was also because it was the Joker. And when you think about Dark Knight Rises, you think about the performance of Heath Ledger, in large part because of how great that performance was, but also because of that character. Do you ever worry that you're doing too good a job with your villains, that people will like them more than the hero?
I've worried about that in the case of this book right here. My designated villain, Cordas Tree, is, one of my friends who's read the book says that, she's really interesting to read about. I wrote back this is an IM message. I wrote back and said, but she really is the bad guy. She really is evil. She manipulates people and controls them and turns them into her puppets and so on. Yeah, but she's still interesting to read about. Well, I guess it's okay that she's interesting.
The straight guy in fiction is always the good guy. You'll never find a straight guy villain. It's just boring. You need something to play off. You need what's causing the conflict in the novel. In the crime novel, for example, who made that body dead? The villain did. That's what drives the story. So worrying about having your villain be too appealing to the audience, impossible. No, I think writers love it. They want them to be as colorful as possible, larger than life, but believable and credible. Yes?
That's like people being fascinated by the man-eating tiger. As a villain, it's the fascination with the dangerous, or that cobra. Everybody wants to look but not be too close. Same with the villain.
Sure. Why do true crime books sell so well? Often, probably a majority of the time, the main character, quote unquote, is a sociopath. And like I said earlier, those people are generally broken, and they're not as interesting in fiction, usually, not always. But, you just want to... Is this true, really? You just want to maybe try and understand what psychiatrists and psychologists don't understand.
And I think if your villain's starting to get really good, you can just take it as a challenge that you have to make your hero just a little bit better. It's the better. I mean, that's what they always say too. Is your hero has to have a worthy antagonist, right? And so you want to have a strong, colorful villain who does things. So I think it would probably tend to have the effect of boosting your hero and better. The better your villain, the better your hero.
It diminishes your protagonist if your antagonist is a wuss who collapses at the first blow. Speaking of which, in 1980, when Empire Strikes Back came out, and this is before George Lucas started meddling with his own movies, I noticed that when Luke Skywalker appeared, Han Solo appeared, or Princess Leia appeared, the audience applauded. Then they switch over to Darth Vader and his command ship, and Darth Vader got at least as much applause as any of the so-called good guys. This time I thought, why are they clapping? But Darth Vader was just such a compelling villain that people wanted to see more of him.
There's a question.
What about Moriarty and Sherlock Holmes? There's the arch villain and the arch hero.
Yeah.
The hero is the kind of an anti-hero. There's a point in the Sherlock Holmes series where you kind of wonder if somehow Sherlock Holmes isn't Moriarty.
Okay. Yeah.
That leads to a really good question. That is, how much do you tailor your villain to your hero? How much do they need to be reflections of each other? How much do they have to have in common?
I personally wouldn't tailor them to the hero at all. I would say they're two separate people. They have two separate sets of needs, and those two sets of needs are in opposition with each other. If you tailor too much, I would suspect you would end up creating a foil for your main character, and foils belong to smaller characters and shorter fiction, I would believe, unless someone can set me straight on that. I would not... someone else talk.
I'm not sure what you mean by tailor one to another. Because one of the ways, if they are opponents for a long time, they shape each other. Like two rocks binding together, they will shape each other.
It's the definition of conflict. It's action, reaction, more action, and...
They will like I said, old enemies will miss each other when one is gone, because who knows yourself better than an old enemy?
But that might be more true in a series like Sherlock Holmes, where he's got his long-standing enemy, and they would become, maybe they are alternate sides of one whole kind of thing. I would say it could vary, though, Steve. I just let the story evolve and the villain becomes the villain. But I think you could have a story where the villain seems to be a kind of alternate personality to the hero. That could be
Yeah, I was just thinking about that.
You might have a story. The story could just, if the story evolves that way, I think it could be an interesting thing if it's the dark side of your protagonist.
Sure, and that's the secret. If the story evolves that way,
yes.
if it's natural for what these characters want, then sure, fine.
Yeah.
Do you have a comment?
Well, it's interesting. I was thinking Paradise Lost.
Okay.
And the protagonist is Satan.
Yeah, and everybody says he's the most interesting character because the bad guy is fun.
Well, he's also the most interesting character because he's the one who made the choice that makes everything happen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
He chose to rebel.
Yeah, but C.S. Lewis had a conniption fit over that in his preface to Paradise Lost that he wrote. He says that the magnificence that Satan has when he's just been thrown into the lake of fire with his great speech, what do the field be lost, all is not lost, etc., etc. But he later he goes over to the earthly paradise, and he watches Adam and Eve making love, and Lewis says, "See, look at this. The further away he gets from God, the more insignificant he becomes. He starts out as sort of a magnificent villain, and then he becomes a voyeur. So there's more than one way of looking at Satan in Paradise Lost."
Do you have a question?
They have more than one villains in a book or in a series book, and you kill one by one, and then at the end you kill the last one. Does that work that way?
You can do whatever you want. Yeah, if you want a different villain for the next one, sure. And a lot of crime books do work on that model.
All start. You have more than one villain at the beginning, but you kill the insignificant ones until.
Oh, I see. Taking out the minions before you get to the level boss.
I get you. Okay.
First you fight the black ninja because he dresses in black because it makes him harder to see. And then you fight the white ninja because he's so good that he doesn't have to wear black to be invisible. And then you fight the red ninja because he can throw fireballs.
Oh, yes? He's got a question.
Draw the line at what your villain can do. I'm thinking today with social media, real life villains are pretty horrific. Right?
Absolutely. I would only draw the line if the needs of the story dictate it. If it's a cozy story, for example, without much violence, without showing the violence occurred, then you don't want your villain to be perpetrating all sorts of nasty, terrible deeds. But in terms of creating a terribly scary, realistic person that someone might suspect could influence behavior in society or something, great. That's what fiction is. You want the most realistic, most scary, most credible characters you can find.
Yeah, and as Steve says, it depends really on the kind of books you write. And it's not that you're limiting yourself. It's just probably some people don't have an interest in writing those kind of gory things, and other people do. So if you like that, go for it. You would have an audience.
In what ways can a villain show us things about what it means to be human that a hero can't really do?
That's heavy.
Someone else has to answer that.
Oh, that's too heavy.
Show us the depraved part inside ourselves, perhaps?
Well, this might sound strange, but I think you don't have to, when you're writing a villain, you don't have to worry about them too much, especially if he's an upfront villain and we know he's the villain right from the start. Like, you don't have to worry about political correctness or making him sympathetic. And so he could kind of portray really dark ideas and dark thoughts that you might not want to put in your hero because people wouldn't go for him.
Sometimes people have asked me, don't you really love to write villains because you can do all the things you really wanted to do, but we're always afraid that somebody would see you?
Uh-huh.
And I thought it wasn't true, but lately I've realized it really is. And for example, for a fairly safe example, I've become a real potty mouth, and it's only started to become a problem because I've recently taken a day job, and that's not where you want to have a potty mouth. But the reason I have a potty mouth, by the way, in my defense, is that I discovered some years ago that if my wife is in a bad mood and I just say something awful, she laughs and laughs and laughs. It just delights her. Her favorite character in all of television is Deborah Morgan from Dexter, because she just cannot say a sentence without 3 or 4 F-bombs coming out and blowing up all over everybody. But the books that I'm currently writing, there's a limit to the coarse language that we will use in those books because they range from middle teens up to adults. But I think that when I'm writing a book outside of that, an independent book, something set in the current, right, in the real world, a villain or a secondary character is where I'm going to get all my potty mouth out. I'm just going to go bananas, and that'll be my release. And you can accept that sort of thing from villains, certainly, and perhaps from some other secondary characters when you can't really accept it, usually, depending on whether you live in England, from a hero.
That's right.